Well, Mark, it's awesome to have you back again. Sorry we had to record a second time. I've had nasty audio issues, which for, doing what I do is not a good thing. So I think I've got everything sorted out, and it's good to have you back. Thanks for doing this.
It's good to be back, and no problem. Stuff happens. You get the little gremlins in there, and you just got to excise them. So no problem.
True story. Hey, we were just talking about when we talked about this last time, I kind of had to fall on my sword a little bit, which I'm okay with, and admit that outdoor wireless and LTE and things like that are not my strong suit, obviously, because I work more on the ICX and Wi-Fi side of it. But when you look at, we're talking about how I'm located in Colorado and you're on the East Coast in Maryland, and when you look at that, are there areas in the country where getting outdoor wireless coverage is more of a challenge for you than others?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I can tell you two stories. My brother, lives in a fairly tony part of the county in Maryland, but he's kind of rural, and he is having a heck of a time getting broadband. He uses a wireless internet service provider, which is okay. It's pretty expensive. In fact, he uses the same one I do. And so he's getting a higher bandwidth. I'm paying $80 a month, almost $70 a month for 10 down and 4 up. He's paying about $120 a month for 25 down and 10 up. And then you're stuck. You really got no choice. You could use a satellite provider, but there's latency issues there. And Starlink, when Starlink comes on board, there may be some stuff there, but Starlink's website says you might suffer outages as the satellites go past. So there are large swaths of the country where broadband is at a premium and or not even available. And that's one of the things that the new administration is trying to do is to put $100 million out there, $100 billion, out there to seed broadband. And there have been a lot of programs going back years. Most recent ones are something called CAF, which is now I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's funding to support rural broadband. And then there was RDOF, which is Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which was a reverse auction, actually, $16 billion to actually fund broadband projects. And now in the president's current budget, he's looking for $100 billion to fund broadband projects as well. So, anybody probably would have access to satellite, but that, like I said, that has issues. So, broadband connectivity has been an issue depending upon where you live. And COVID has certainly underscored that or highlighted that in areas where you're looking for rural connectivity. When kids can't go to school, they're left with using, internet to try to connect. And if they're in areas where they don't have really good connectivity, some of them actually have to use dial-up, which is, in this day and age, that's kind of almost unheard of. That's kind of like Model T technology. And we've been involved, on the Ruckus side of the company on some of that, helping to stand up little hotspots using some of the latest technologies, and things like in school buses, for example. We have put some of the Ruckus devices that use a brand new radio service called Citizens Broadband Radio Service to backhaul traffic that's distributed using Wi-Fi. And so we've done a little bit of that collaboratively, and then we've done some of that also for hospitals to set up triage centers. In the early days of the pandemic, when people were presenting at hospital in droves, they did not want people presenting in the emergency room, so they set up these remote triage centers, and we were able to provide some of our devices to help with the backhauling traffic there. So, I think as we move on in time, rural broadband will become more plentiful. But right now, it's still difficult. So we're hoping to solve that with with new technology and just new incentives.
It's really interesting how certain areas you're going to be. This is what cracks me up. I was talking to a friend of ours, that's a contractor, is doing some stuff for us at the house, and we were having to look. I need to dig a trench out in the backyard to get some power ran. Well, the fiber that comes into the house is located, so I don't have to have it located. But sitting there looking at it, and you've got fiber that runs into a box, and then it goes coax out of that into the house when there's already Cat5 ran in the entire house.
Really?
And I come from a telco background where coax, that's a DS3. That was like 45 megasecond. That's it. I mean, DOCSIS gets you, they can compress it to death so that you actually get those speeds, so they say.
Yeah.
But, I mean, looking at more of a spectrum-based internet solution or even satellite-based, I mean, like you try to use it on an airplane, I refuse to pay for it because it doesn't work anyways. Yeah. It's been TCP windowed to death, and it's just. And the other problem is, you take people like yourself and like me who understand the technology enough. It's like, I'm not doing this. I already know what's going on.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned onboard aircraft. There's two problems there. One of them, obviously, is you said, the TCP issues on board. Although you can effectuate that with just more spectrum or more access points. Obviously, as with aircraft, there's a weight issue and a trade-off. Although, of course, these things aren't very heavy. But the real problem really is the downlink. Some of them people use GoGo, and GoGo downlinks they're very small bandwidth. And so the ones that use GoGo, I believe, it's interesting. I think United uses GoGo. And a couple of others. And then there's Southwest that actually uses a satellite thing. And United used to use a satellite. And the satellite connectivity is a little better. So what that does is, if you look at an aircraft, you'll see roughly in the middle part of the fuselage, you'll see this round antenna, a round radome. That round radome is for the satellite antenna to do internet on the aircraft. So, I pick and choose the aircraft based on their satellite connectivity. But I won't mention the airlines, but there's some of them where I just won't pay for it. Yep. Because it just isn't worth it. It's not. It's mostly just getting angry. You're paying $8, $12, $30 sometimes, depending upon how long you're flying across the country, and you're getting low dial-up speeds, and so it's just not worth it. And you know this because we use OneDrive. You can't suppress you can suppress the connection to OneDrive, but if you don't think about it, then all your OneDrive files are syncing, and then there goes your bandwidth. Yep. So, that's something that's there's no reason that has to be the way it is, and maybe I'm hoping that coming out of COVID, airlines recognize that and can help it.
Yeah, my brother-in-law he works maintenance for one of the airlines, and there's multiple times he sent me pictures of a box, and he's like, "Hey, you know what that is?" I'm like, "I know exactly what that is, actually." Yeah. So, but I'm curious to see how it. I mean, I think the satellite stuff. I guess one of the other thing that's kind of interesting to me as well is, there are so many people in the country now that need reliable internet connectivity that's affordable. And that's a really disheartening statement for me to make. I mean, everything that is done now, like the kids' schoolwork, it's all online. And that terrifies me a little bit that we need people to have access to that stuff. So I'm just curious to see how this stuff starts to migrate over time. I mean, one thing we're pretty good at is finding new ways to deliver this stuff. So we'll kind of see what happens.
Well, I'm hoping, and this is me speaking personally without any sort of corporate thing, but I'm hoping that, sooner hopefully, is that we as a society can adopt broadband as a utility and give it that type of importance. So that it's broadly, no pun intended, but it's broadly available and affordable. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, there are programs that can help, if it's not affordable or for whatever reason, or for people that can't afford it for whatever reason, there are programs available that will subsidize, like we do for power and gas and water and all of that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we fully adopted the notion of broadband as a utility. And so I don't know that, whatever your political stripes are, that it doesn't really matter, but that's the problem. And I think as we come through COVID and realize that, remote learning is a thing, whether we like it or not, certainly telehealth is a thing. And telehealth was a thing that was forming well before COVID. And, you talk about going, in rural areas where you've got to drive hours to get to a physician. that's just not feasible. And so if there's certain things that you can do using, advanced technology, I know current technologies, an iPhone and an internet connection, a physician or even a nurse practitioner or some healthcare practitioner can use those capabilities to do a very in-depth review of what your symptoms are and decide what you need to do. And that means you don't have to get in the car and waste time driving to someplace that maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. So once we as a society or as a country adopt the notion of broadband as a utility, I think then we'll see more incentives for connections. There's no dearth of technology, and certainly there's no dearth of spectrum options to effectuate that. Their Wi-Fi, they've just opened up 1,200 megahertz in the 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi. Those opportunities will soon be realized. You can go now and buy a Wi-Fi 6E access point at Best Buy. They're not cheap, but they operate fully across the 6 gigahertz band and give you channels up to 320 megahertz wide. You got to do some work to get that, but certainly you can get them at 160 megahertz wide, and 160 megahertz wide Wi-Fi channel is smoking. But the trouble is, it's only as fast as the pipeline going in, and so that's the thing. It's a broad ecosystem, and we've kind of got to work across the board to do that. And I think as wireless carriers can add Wi-Fi capabilities to their cells, or at least backhaul capabilities, and there's more backhaul available, hopefully we'll be able to see in rural areas giving people a choice rather than having to go to whomever is there. My situation is the only two choices I have are use a wireless ISP or a WISP, or three choices: dial up, which is not a choice really, or go satellite. And satellite, the trouble with satellite is the latency issues, and so we would not be able to have this conversation like we're having now if I use satellite. You would be okay for other data, but not for voice calls. They're working on that. Starlink is coming out with these low Earth orbit satellites. In fact, they just got clearance from the FCC to allow satellites that are in orbits that are just a few hundred kilometers above the Earth, and so that'll cut down on the latency. However, one of the offshoots of that for me, because I love to watch the night sky, is a lot of space junk up there. They are planning to deploy north of 10,000 satellites. And so, which I think, for broadband coverage, that's great. But I guess one of the things you give up is, a dark sky. And so they're actually working to try to fix that, using satellite technologies that are very small, that don't reflect a lot of light. But this stuff is all nascent. So I'm hopeful that, in 5 years, there'll be a lot more broadband options for people, not only for in the home, but also for backhaul, because we're almost there.
I was going to ask you about the space junk, because I know that's a concern that SpaceX has talked about, and NASA as well, just because there is so much crap up there, and then you're talking about dumping 10,000 more satellites in there. I'm convinced that Elon Musk he's the closest thing we'll ever have to a real life James Bond villain.
Well, I'll hold judgment on him. I find the guy at one point brilliant and another point just flaky. I think those sort of two go in the same. And SpaceX is his vision. And, Falcon 9 just launched last weekend, which actually they launched from Canaveral, and I was actually able to see that. They launched and went up the East Coast, and so that was kind of exciting.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was kind of cool. And he and SpaceX have done to space flight what commercial people need to do: ingenuity, funding, and not being sucked down by a lot of the government bureaucracy. And that said, Michael Collins just died yesterday, and there went the last of the Apollo 11. Well, actually, Buzz Aldrin's still alive, but you're just seeing NASA's just can't do it with government funding, and so the emergence of commercial people getting into this is great. But you're right, space junk is a problem. I just read an article this morning that said that when you consider objects as small as a millimeter, there are over 1 million objects above the Earth that at any given time could pose hazards, not only to the things that we already have up there, but also cause problems to the dark sky. And I remember going out last year in the summer and looking up and seeing, it was kind of cool actually, but seeing some of, I don't know if it was SpaceX or what it was, but just seeing satellites going over one at a time. From east to west. I'm sorry, west to east. One went over, and then another went over, and then another went over, pretty much within the same orbit, probably a few degrees separating each other. And although it was kind of cool to see that, if I was looking up at the night sky trying to do some astrophotography or even through a telescope, that stuff coming across my field of view would just sort of blot out anything you're looking at. So I'm not sure what the answer is to it. The only way really to get broadband is through non-terrestrial technologies. Or unless you incentivize terrestrial-based technologies to deploy cell sites in areas where there's like 2 people. And, I don't know that there is a business model that's going to make that work. So we're kind of left with, those types of things. And, there's good and bad to it. And I think we're going to have to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, I was, how old was I? 18, I think. I saw one space shuttle take off, and it was a night launch. I was in Daytona Beach, Florida, and it was a night launch. And in Daytona, it was like daylight, like the sun came up. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my entire life. I'll never forget that. That was really, really cool.
That is a bucket item for me, is to watch, something go off from Canaveral or for Kennedy Space Flight Center. I mean, seeing SpaceX or seeing the Falcon 9 launch was really cool. I did not expect that it would be as bright. I took a picture of it. It's just a little speck on the photo, but it was really cool. And I'm not far from Wallops. I'm about 300 miles, line of sight miles from Wallops. And I've seen launches at Wallops before. They're less spectacular. I mean, the Falcon 9 was pretty cool. But the Wallops launches, if you're into that sort of thing, and I am, watching that stuff is just really neat. Not only the fact that it's so far away, but also, what they're doing. And so, but yeah, those, the space geek in me, I grew up with the Apollo program. I was a kid, 7, 8 years old when Apollo was happening. And I hinged on I know where I was when they walked on the moon. I was sitting in front of our little 12-inch black and white TV set with a real tape recorder that I bought at People's Drugstore, recording the whole thing. So that was one of the coolest things ever. Yeah. So, looking up at the night sky is just you get a sense of awe looking at the night sky that is just unmatchable with anything else. So seeing it obliterated or just blotted out by satellites, I don't know that that's for me it's sad, but I know that those satellites are doing good things, so it's sort of a mixed reaction, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think I think it's really, really cool. I mean, I was lucky enough a couple of years ago, I got to go to Kennedy Space Center. I think I talked to Chris Kalura about this, but going in there, I didn't realize that there's a certain distance limitation that you can't be within when those things launch, because the sound vibrations alone will kill you.
Yeah.
And when they told me that, I was like, that didn't even dawn on me. Like, just that much absolute raw power behind that thing is just insane. I think it's just human accomplishments that, you kind of have to be proud of a little bit, because they were able to pull that stuff off,
Well, the Saturn V rocket, believe it had 5 engines, was capable of over a couple million pounds of thrust. So, that the sheer power of that, just when you look at it in terms of power, is absolutely incredible. That we can do that and send people, to out of the at least the Earth's pull. And also the thing that just made, this isn't telecom per se. Actually, it is telecom. Another thing that just I was all giddy about was the opportunity, Perseverance on Mars, where they were actually able to remotely fly a helicopter on another planet. And so that was all done with wireless technology. Now they, the helicopter or drone, with Perseverance was it had a code loaded in it, but they did kick it off remotely. And so, and that's another thing I just find fascinating is all of the wireless technology that has to happen to effectuate that. When you think of, again, Falcon 9, the ton of telemetry coming down from that aircraft, not just the aircraft or the spacecraft, not just the spacecraft, but from the astronauts on it. They have those guys and gals are wired up. So at any given time, they know all of their vital signs.
Mm-hmm.
Then so there's that in addition to at any given time. I mean, they're getting that stuff on a second update, and then they're getting all the telemetry on the spacecraft. That is a lot of data coming down that I think is just, is fascinating. Which is interesting when you think about kind of getting into another sort of geeky realm, aircraft flying, and the inability right now. Not because of technology, but mostly just because of attitude, I guess, of downlinking data that would necessarily be caught on the black boxes. There is no reason why we could not downlink all that information and then be able to know in real time what's going on with a given aircraft. So that if God forbid an aircraft crashes, you wouldn't have to search for the black boxes. You'd already have the telemetry data. Yep. So again, we could do that wirelessly with no problem. There's just, I guess, policy issues that keep that from happening. But again, the wireless technology exists today to be able to do all of that downlinking.
Have you ever flown in or out of John Wayne in Orange County, California?
I have. I'm a pilot, so and
awesome.
I've never flown pilot into there. But that is an interesting airport because it's really a 2-runway airport. But you really only use one just because of the winds. And so at any given time, you'll have 737, I think is the biggest aircraft that can go in there. But you'll have 737s going off with a Cessna 172 right behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I don't know that I'd want to fly in that area just because you've really got to be on your game to fly behind those if you're flying a lighter aircraft just because of something called wake turbulence, which can kill you if you're not careful. Yep. But just sit there and watch the aircraft, going in and out of there. I mean, it's just a potpourri of aircraft, so it's kind of fun. Yeah. And I've flown in there before. At Southwest, I think, goes into there. And over the time, I've worked out in Newport Beach a lot, and just the road goes right by it, and I just kind of love watching the aircraft go in and out of there.
Oh, I know. I get distracted all the time, just sitting there staring at airplanes like some kind of goober. But it was pretty funny. I've only flown out of there, I think, once or twice. And the first time I knew what was going to happen. I mean, I was already aware because I'd heard of it before, and there was a guy, it was a Southwest flight, and I was sitting there, and a guy sitting next to me, we took off and got out of there, because the main problem with that isn't just the noise restrictions, it's that the runway is barely over a mile. I mean, it's a really short runway, but they got those brakes locked up and spooled that 37 up and got up and out of there, and the guy sitting next to me looked at me and goes, "Man, I really wish my car would do that." I was like, I hear you.
There, one is that they want to get above the, in case they lose an engine, they want to get as much altitude as they can so they have room to get back rather than, plow into any of the homes around there. I mean, that's an example of airports where the environment is encroached on the airport. I mean, that's all over the place. There was a really cool airport in Chicago called Meeks Field that was a fully general aviation airport, and there was a lot of tussling between. And it was a municipal airport, but there was a lot of tussling between the owners of the airport the people that flew in and out of the airport. And it was actually a reliever airport for both Midway and O'Hare. So you'd see a lot of corporate jets go in there. Well, they got crossways with the mayor at the time, which was a daily, who's all, those are the mayors. And at night he got dispatched heavy equipment to tear the runway up. So no one could get in, no one could land anymore. Basically, he just, deep sixed the airport. And so there were a lot of jets that were stranded there, and they had to get special clearance to take off on taxiways.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. But Midway's another one. Going into Midway Airport, that's a treat because that airport is, again, in the middle of the city. And it's called Midway. It's named after the Battle of Midway. So when you fly into the airport, you'll see a lot of the aircraft that were either replicas or actually non-flyable airplanes there. That participated in that battle. And my dad participated in the battle. He was a pilot in the Second World War. He was a carrier-based dive bomber pilot, and so there's a Helldiver there, and that's what he flew. So every time I go into Midway, I make a point of looking at the Helldiver, going, "Yep, I'm flying. My dad flew that." So,
oh, wow.
So yeah, it's really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that airport is interesting. My Midway story is not anything nearly as fun and entertaining as that, so I'll leave that one for another day. It's just funny because when you travel a lot, you just run into so many weird issues, and I was laughing because if my wife and I go anywhere, she notices everything. Like, she's paying attention, and she's like, "Did you see this? And did you see?" And I'm like, "No." Like, I've got this really special knack that when I get on an airplane, I can just tune everything and everyone out, because people don't travel well. I mean, they really don't, unfortunately. So you end up seeing people at their worst a little bit, and
yeah,
but whatever, it is what it is. I did want to ask you about this because I don't. There's a CBRS PAL auction coming up in October.
No, the CBRS auction already happened. The auction coming up in October is the auction for the 3.45 gig bands, 345 to 355. And that's supposed to happen. They're saying early October right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and that has a pretty big price tag behind it too, doesn't it?
Well, that's a good point. That auction is a spectrum that has a bunch of federal operations in it, mostly DoD, and so back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was an act came from the commission, or the Congress, called the Spectrum Relocation Act, which specified the development of something called the Spectrum Relocation Fund. And the use of them. So what it says is that in bands where there is going to be potential shared use with the DoD, or federal users, not just DoD, or relocation of federal users, a portion of this monies from the auction have to go into a fund to pay for all of that. So primarily to pay for relocation and or sharing. Well, in this band, there are a lot of DoD things. In fact, that's all DoD stuff, and these are things of radars and a lot of radar operations, a lot of shipborne radars. And so, what the act says is that the government, has to work to identify the minimum cost to relocate or share with all those things. And for this auction, it came out at almost over $14.7 billion. And so what that says is that the auction has to net at least that much to pay for this, or you don't have an auction. And so there had been some concern in the discussions around that auction that the FCC needed to craft the band so that it was of high enough interest to people that they would spend that amount of money. That occurs on the heels of the 3.7 gig auction, which finalized back in January, I believe it was, and or maybe it was March. And so that auction, there were not the same federal encumbrances. The encumbrances in that band were earth stations. That is what's called the C-band, and all of the earth stations are receive earth stations, and some are receive only, and they're receiving signals coming down from satellites. A lot of it's to distribute programming, and Disney has a lot of satellites in that band. NPR has satellites, ESPN. So anyhow, that relocation is paid for by the new entrants. But they ended up paying $81 billion for that in consideration of the fact that they have to relocate these things. And that was 280 megahertz. So now you look at the 345 to 355, that's 100 megahertz. The new entrants are going to have to pay minimum $14.7 billion of auction proceeds. So that auction has got to come in at, like I said, $14.77, actually, to be accurate, $billion. And so a lot of people were concerned that if the commission didn't make the licenses valuable or interestingly enough, then they wouldn't buy it. And so that was one of the things the commission had to do in the rulemaking, was to make it so that there'd be enough interest. And most people believe they did. We'll have to see. it'd be a shame if they hold an auction and no one shows up. So, but I think the way they've done it now is there'll be enough interest. The AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon, even if they spent a third of what they spent in the C-band auction or the 3.7 gig auction, they'll make that reserve price with no problem.
How long does the old spectrum stick around? Do they start to decommission that slowly over time?
Well, no, they don't decommission it. They're still. I mean, they're still using it. I mean, the carriers are. The very first spectrum that was deployed for what they called it cellular phone systems at the time was 800 megahertz band, and that's still used. What carriers do, their spectrum holdings are, in bands and chunks. And so there's spectrum in the 800 megahertz band, the 600 megahertz band, the 700 megahertz band, the 2.1 gig, the 1.7. And so what they do is they apportion certain parts of their traffic consistent with the bandwidth limitations to the band. So, for example, early analog, they called it AMPS, stand for mobile phone system. I think it was an amplified mobile phone system. That was, those were 12.5 kilohertz wide channels, and as voice. Well, as we moved into digital, then some of what they did was they just put the SMS traffic there, the testing traffic, because that stuff is low bandwidth need. It's you can handle some latency, and so they just shoved it down in there. Sometimes they'll put pilot channels in other bands, so that when they're tracking cell phones to ensure handoff, they're not taking valuable spectrum that's needed for voice. So the spectrum never really gets, thrown away, so to speak. Now, what's happened in commercial side? What happens on the government side is that with the need for more spectrum, I think one of the things that's a sort of a rule of thumb anymore, as you go up in Gs, 3G, 4G, 5G, you double the spectrum needed to effectuate those Gs. So that means that, when we go from 4G to 5G, we need more spectrum, twice as much as we needed for 4G. And so we're always looking for more spectrum. And so a lot of that is driven by the need to be able to have, macrocellular without, having complications on the handsets. And so they're looking for spectrum in the mid bands, and the mid bands are typically 3 gig to 8 gigahertz. And so when the industry is looking for more spectrum, they're looking at spectrum in these mid-band ranges. And that's why the 3.7 gig band was of a high interest, largely also because I won't say that band was fallow, but it could have been put, it's being put to, some argue, more higher use, if you will. It's more data use. Same with the CBRS band and now the 3.45 gig band. And so what that means is the stuff that's in there has got to move to other things. And the FCC has typically been amenable to those types of things. Take, for example, the 6 gigahertz band, which, as I mentioned earlier, where there's new Wi-Fi allocations there. Well, that band had been home to point-to-point microwave that had been used for backhaul for years, for 50 years probably. And so the FCC said, look, is backhaul really the best use for 1200 megahertz? And they came to the conclusion, not the best use, so we're going to allow licensed guys to come in there and share. So there's this constant sort of spectrum churning, if you will, where new uses come in, and then the industry that we're in has to come up with ways to figure out how to make that work. Sometimes it's moving them out, and sometimes it's allowing them to share. And so, that's just the spectrum life cycle, so to speak. That happens ongoing, and that'll probably happen for forever. They're not making more spectrum, so we're going to have to figure out how to, share better.
Yeah. So are there pretty big challenges with some of this now just because of the massive silicon shortage we have in the world right now?
Well, those are spot challenges. I think the silicon shortage will get solved. Certainly you need silicon to put these things on form factors that are the size of a smartphone. You might remember the first cell phones out there, which were just basically telephones, were huge. I remember the first call I made was in 1986 I was doing some work and with a colleague, we're doing some actually signal strength measurements, and we needed to be able to call each other to do some coordination. So we had these phones, and those things were literally the size of a brick. Didn't weigh as much as a brick, but they weighed a whole lot more than they do now. Now with the miniaturization, it's all about silicon. And the fascinating thing about smartphones anymore is, we were talking about spectrum. They manage spectrum all the way down to the not the kilohertz, but the UHF range, all the way up to millimeter wave, because a lot of 5G operations are in the millimeter waves, and the millimeter waves are in the tens of gigahertz, it's 28 to 49 gigahertz. So being able to put all of that technology on a phone and have it work it's magic, first of all, but it's all based on silicon. And so the way that we're going to be able to use these technologies is by putting it on a chip. And this shortage is a spot shortage that's related to problems related to COVID. Some have argued it's poor planning. I probably won't go there, but it certainly is COVID issues and others. So we'll get that solved, and we'll be back on our feet no time at all.
Yeah. Yep. It's really, really cool to me to sit down and talk to you about this stuff, because it's just such a different world.
Yeah, cool.
And the problem is I probably have 806 stupid questions, but to people more familiar with this and the technology of it. I mean, one thing I'm wondering too is, as spectrum evolves, you take your cell sites, right? You go to a tower. I mean, how many times can carriers really retrofit those things to support the new technology before it just looks like a giant Christmas tree in the air?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And we're in the middle of that in the company. What we're trying to do is come up with a bunch of things. What we're trying to do is come up with some very, really cool concealment options. The MetroCell line does that. But also to be more perspicacious with our antenna technologies, so that we can kind of try to sort of predict the bands that are going to be needed, so we can build that into the antenna, so that you don't have to climb up the antenna or climb up the tower and change out the antenna. That's expensive, because you have to use tower climbers, and those guys and gals, that's first of all, it's dangerous, and secondly, that's one of the reasons it's expensive. So what we're trying to do in CommScope is be a little bit more forward thinking and a visionary, if you will, on our antenna considerations, so that we know what is on the offing before it happens, so that you don't have to climb up the tower and change the antenna when you have a new band. And so we have some antennas that can handle numerous bands. I mean, it's really mind-boggling when you look at the bottom of that antenna and see all of the connections. I've seen antennas that we make that have 64 connections on the bottom. I mean, that is just crazy. And the form factor is they're big antennas, but they can handle a bunch of bands. I remember being at Mobile World Congress a few years ago, and we had an antenna that we worked with Nokia on. That damn thing was 10 feet tall. That thing was huge. But you put that on the tower, and you are pretty good for the foreseeable future. And that's kind of what it's all about, is to kind of be able to predict that, and all the stuff up and down, the waveguide or the coax or whatever. We're pretty good at that. I mean, that's what we do. Our guys that do antenna designs are pretty sharp people, and antenna technology is really very cutting edge. The plumbing part probably isn't, but the antenna technology is. And then all the RAN stuff, we don't dabble in the RAN, but with a one cell product line, we can really do a lot of interesting work in the building. And also with the Ruckus. So we're constantly trying to think ahead as to what's coming down the pike, to make sure we can accommodate that in our offerings, to keep people from having to go back and buy new SKUs. So that's largely what we do.
Yeah, that's wow, that's mind-boggling. 64 connections, that's crazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you really got to know what you're doing to put those in.
Yeah, no kidding. I hate to do this because I'm about to run out of time. I could sit here and talk to you about this stuff for hours on end, and I would love to have you come back and chat again in the future.
I'd love to. This is fun. Your questions are well informed. I really enjoy talking to you. It's and this is, I'm sure you talk to others in the company, but we do cool stuff. and we're on the cutting edge of things. And my background in area is spectrum, so I'm kind of plowing ahead, kind of trying to help prepare us for, what are the next spectrum opportunities. Make some of that happen, but identify what that means. And so I get to see some of this stuff before it's real, but I just think it's very cool. I love it.
Yeah, I do too. We do some pretty cool stuff. I really enjoy that part of it for sure.
Yeah, me too.
Yep. Mark, come back and do this again. I really appreciate it.
Well, I will, Matt. I will. It's my pleasure, and thanks for having me. And I look forward to talking to you again. Your questions are well informed, so I can't wait for the next ones.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't think it's well informed. I think it's just I'm curious and perfectly fine admitting that I don't know anything and I'm an idiot, so it's easy.
Well, your questions are good. So, but I don't get a chance to talk to too many people that have such good questions. But you're part of the company too, and so I think you know where we're coming from. But yeah, good questions. Thanks, yeah. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
You got it. I'll shoot you an invite. We'll do it again.
Excellent. All right. Talk to you soon, man. Thanks.
Hey, you got it. Thank you.
All right, bye.
All right, see everybody.
Thank you for listening to Ruckcast. If you just found us for the first time, be sure to follow or subscribe on your platform of choice so you can be notified of future episodes. If you have ideas for future episodes or can't find Ruckcast on your favorite platform, contact us at ruckcast@commscope.com. And as always, thanks for listening.